Welcome to Unbound American Stories, the channel where we uncover the lives of the extraordinary figures who shaped our nation, often from the shadows. These are the voices that history textbooks sometimes overlook, the rebels, thinkers, and visionaries who dared to challenge the status quo and change the course of America. Today's story is one of the most powerful of them all, the life of Thomas Paine, a man whose words ignited revolutions and whose ideas still echo in the fight for justice and liberty. This audio novel, Thomas Paine, The Flame of Revolution: How One Man's Words Ignited Liberty, is based on AI-generated research and is designed to spark your curiosity. Think of it as the beginning of a conversation, not the final word. If you're conducting serious research or preparing work for publication, we encourage you to dig deeper into peer-reviewed academic and historical sources to confirm facts and interpretations. So, what makes Thomas Paine's story so unforgettable? He was the immigrant who wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet that convinced a nation to declare independence. He was the voice of the American crisis, the series of essays that kept George Washington's army fighting when all seemed lost. He was the radical who dared to challenge monarchy, slavery, and organized religion, even when it cost him everything. And he was the man who, despite being forgotten in death, left behind a legacy that would inspire abolitionists, labor reformers, and civil rights leaders for centuries to come. This is not just a story about the past. It's a story about the power of ideas, the courage to speak truth to power, and the enduring fight for a more just world. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce the voice behind this story, the storyteller, Ben. Enjoy the journey.
Thank you, Lisa. Thomas Paine, The Flame of Revolution: How One Man's Words Ignited Liberty. Chapter 1. The Boy from Thetford, A Spark in the Darkness, 1737 to 1759. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Thetford, a small market town in the east of England, on a cold January night in 1737. Inside a modest cottage, Joseph Paine, a corset maker, paced the floor as his wife Frances labored to bring their first child into the world. At midnight on January 29th, the cries of a newborn boy filled the room. They named him Thomas, after Joseph's father. Little did they know that this child would one day set the world ablaze with his words. Thetford was a town of contrasts. Its ancient ruins whispered of a glorious past, while its present was marked by poverty and hardship. The Paine family was poor, but they were not without dignity. Joseph was a Quaker, a member of a religious group known for their simplicity, pacifism, and belief in the equality of all people. These values seeped into young Thomas's bones, shaping his worldview from the earliest age. As a boy, Thomas was curious and bright, with a thirst for knowledge that set him apart from his peers. He attended the local grammar school, where he learned to read and write, but his education was cut short at the age of 13. His father, struggling to make ends meet, needed him to learn a trade. Thomas became an apprentice corset maker, a job that required precision and patience, but offered little in the way of intellectual stimulation. The young boy chafed under the monotony of the work, his mind wandering to the books he borrowed from the local library. One book in particular captured his imagination: The Spectator, a collection of essays by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. The essays explored politics, philosophy, and society with wit and insight. Thomas devoured them, underlining passages and scribbling notes in the margins. He began to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be, a place where reason and justice prevailed. But life had other plans for Thomas. At 19, he left Thetford to seek his fortune in London. The city was a far cry from the quiet streets of his childhood. It was a place of noise, chaos, and opportunity, where the stench of the Thames mingled with the scent of fresh bread from the bakeries. Thomas found work as a corset maker, but the city's energy called to him. He spent his evenings in coffee houses, listening to debates about politics and philosophy, and his weekends exploring the bustling streets and markets. In 1756, at the age of 19, Thomas married Mary Lambert, the daughter of a local innkeeper. The marriage was short-lived. Mary died in childbirth the following year, along with their child. The loss was a devastating blow, one that left Thomas adrift. He tried his hand at various jobs: teacher, excise officer, even a brief stint as a privateer, but none of them stuck. He was a man searching for his purpose, a spark waiting for the right moment to ignite. That moment came in 1759, when Thomas moved to the town of Sandwich in Kent. There, he took a job as an excise officer, collecting taxes on goods like tea and tobacco. The work was steady, but it was also corrupt. Thomas saw firsthand how the system exploited the poor, how the wealthy avoided taxes while the working class struggled to make ends meet. He began to write pamphlets criticizing the system, arguing for fairer treatment of excise officers and the people they taxed. It was the first flicker of the flame that would one day become a wildfire. Thomas Paine was no longer just a boy from Thetford. He was becoming a man with a mission, a voice for the voiceless, and a pen that would shake the foundations of the world. Chapter 2. The Apprentice of Life, Failures and First Lessons, 1759-1774. Thomas Paine's life in the 1760s was a series of false starts and hard lessons. He was a man in search of his calling, but the path was anything but straight. After his time in Sandwich, he moved to Lewes, a bustling town in Sussex, where he took up work as an excise officer once again. Lewes was a town of merchants and tradesmen, a place where ideas flowed as freely as the ale in its taverns. It was here that Thomas began to find his voice. Lewes was also where Thomas met Elizabeth Olive, the daughter of his landlord. They married in 1771, and for a time life seemed stable. Thomas even opened a small shop selling tobacco and snuff, but his heart wasn't in it. His true passion lay in writing and debate. He joined the local debating society, the Headstrong Club, where he honed his skills as a speaker and thinker. The club met weekly to discuss politics, philosophy, and the issues of the day. Thomas thrived in this environment, his sharp mind and quick wit making him a formidable debater. But his outspokenness came at a cost. In 1772, he published his first major pamphlet, The Case of the Officers of Excise, a plea for better pay and working conditions for excise officers. The pamphlet was a bold move, and it caught the attention of his superiors. In 1774, Thomas was fired from his job for neglecting his duties, specifically for marking goods as inspected without actually inspecting them. It was a minor infraction, but it was the final straw. His marriage, too, was falling apart. Elizabeth left him, and the shop failed. By the summer of 1774, Thomas Paine was broke, unemployed, and alone. It was in this moment of despair that fate intervened. Thomas met Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, then in his late 60s, was a man of boundless energy and curiosity. He was in London as a representative of the American colonies, lobbying for their interests in the face of growing tensions with Britain. Franklin had read Thomas's pamphlet on the excise officers and was impressed by its clarity and passion. The two men struck up a conversation in a London coffee house, and Franklin, recognizing Thomas's potential, encouraged him to seek his fortune in America. "America is a land of opportunity," Franklin told him, "a place where a man can make something of himself, no matter his beginnings. You have a way with words, Mr. Paine. Use them wisely." Franklin gave Thomas a letter of introduction to his son-in-law, Richard Bach, a merchant in Philadelphia. With little more than the clothes on his back and Franklin's letter in his pocket, Thomas set sail for America in October 1774. The journey was rough. Storms battered the ship, and Thomas spent much of the voyage seasick in his bunk. But as the shores of the New World came into view, he felt a sense of hope. America was a blank slate, a place where he could start anew. Philadelphia was a city of contrasts. It was the largest city in the colonies, a hub of commerce and culture. But it was also a city of inequality. The streets teemed with merchants, laborers, and enslaved people, all living side by side. Thomas found lodging in a boarding house and began to explore the city. He visited the Library Company of Philadelphia, a subscription library founded by Franklin, where he devoured books on politics, science, and philosophy. He attended lectures at the American Philosophical Society, where he met some of the brightest minds in the colonies. But Thomas was not content to be a spectator. He wanted to be part of the conversation. In December 1774, he took a job as the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a new publication that aimed to inform and entertain its readers. Under Thomas's leadership, the magazine flourished. He wrote essays on a wide range of topics, from abolition to women's rights, and he published works by other radical thinkers. The magazine became a platform for ideas that challenged the status quo, and Thomas's reputation as a writer and thinker grew. Yet, despite his success, Thomas felt a growing sense of unease. The colonies were on the brink of revolution, and the air was thick with tension. In April 1775, the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord. The colonies were no longer just talking about independence. They were fighting for it. Thomas knew that his pen could be as powerful as any musket. But what would he write, and would anyone listen? Chapter 3. Common Sense, the Pamphlet That Shook the World, 1775-1776. The year 1775 was a turning point for the American colonies. The battles of Lexington and Concord had ignited a war, but the question of independence was still far from settled. Many colonists, including some of the most influential leaders, hesitated. They were British subjects, after all, and the idea of breaking away from the mother country was radical, even treasonous. The Continental Congress debated endlessly, but no consensus emerged. The colonies were united in their grievances against Britain, but divided on what to do about them. Thomas Paine watched these developments with growing frustration. He had been in America for little more than a year, but he had already seen enough to know that the colonies could not remain under British rule. The problem, as he saw it, was not just the policies of King George III or the British Parliament. The problem was the very idea of monarchy itself. In Paine's view, kings were relics of a barbaric past, and hereditary rule was the absurdity. How can a man inherit the right to rule over others, he wondered. It is as ridiculous as inheriting the right to be a god. In the fall of 1775, Paine began writing a pamphlet that would change the course of history. He called it Common Sense. The title was deceptively simple, but the ideas within were revolutionary. Paine wrote in a style that was accessible to the average colonist, avoiding the dense legal language of the Congress or the flowery prose of the elite. He wrote as if he were speaking directly to the reader, using plain language and vivid metaphors to make his case. Society in every state is a blessing, he wrote, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. He argued that the colonies had outgrown their need for British rule. America was a land of immigrants, a melting pot of cultures and ideas. It was time for the colonies to stand on their own, to create a new kind of government, one based on the consent of the governed, not the whims of a distant king. Paine's pamphlet was not just an argument for independence, it was a call to action. He urged the colonists to see themselves not as British subjects, but as Americans, with a shared destiny and a common purpose. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind, he wrote. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Common Sense was published on January 10, 1776. It was an instant sensation. Within weeks it sold 100,000 copies. a staggering number in a nation of just 2.5 million people. It was read aloud in taverns, debated in coffee houses, and passed from hand to hand in the streets. George Washington, then commanding the Continental Army in Massachusetts, ordered that it be read to his troops. "I find common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of many men," he wrote to a friend. The pamphlet's impact was undeniable. It transformed the debate over independence from a political question into a moral one. Before Common Sense, the idea of breaking away from Britain was radical. After Common Sense, it was inevitable. In June 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. The man chosen to write it was Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian with a gift for words. But even Jefferson acknowledged that common sense had paved the way. "This pamphlet is working wonders," he wrote. "It has turned thousands to independence who before were indifferent." Yet, not everyone was pleased with Paine's success. His radical ideas made him enemies, even among the revolutionaries. John Adams, who would later become the second president of the United States, dismissed common sense as a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass. Adams and others feared that Paine's democratic ideals were too extreme, that they would lead to mob rule. But Paine was undeterred. He had seen the power of his words, and he was not about to back down. As the summer of 1776 wore on, the debate over independence reached its climax. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, but it was common sense that had made it possible. Thomas Paine had given the colonists the words they needed to imagine a new nation. Now, they had to fight for it. Chapter 4. The Crisis. Washington's Secret Weapon, 1776-1783. The summer of 1776 was a time of hope for the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, and the dream of a new nation was alive. But hope alone would not win the war. The British Army was the most powerful in the world, and they were determined to crush the rebellion. By the fall of 1776, the Continental Army was in full retreat. Washington's troops had been driven out of New York and were fleeing across New Jersey, harried by British forces at every turn. Morale was at an all-time low. Many soldiers deserted, and those who remained were cold, hungry, and exhausted. It was in this dark hour that Thomas Paine found his next calling. He had already given the Revolution its moral foundation with common sense. Now he would give it its fighting spirit. Paine joined the Continental Army as a volunteer aide to General Nathanael Greene. He marched with the troops, slept in the same freezing camps, and shared their hardships. He saw firsthand the suffering of the soldiers, and he knew that words alone would not win the war. But he also knew that words could inspire men to keep fighting, even when all seemed lost. On December 19, 1776, Paine published the first in a series of pamphlets called The American Crisis. The opening lines were a rallying cry. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." The effect was electric. Washington ordered that the crisis be read aloud to his troops. The words lifted their spirits, steeling their resolve. Just days later, on Christmas night, Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on the Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. The victory was a turning point in the war, and Paine's words had played no small part in it. Paine continued to write The American Crisis throughout the war, publishing 16 pamphlets in total. Each one was a masterclass in persuasive writing, blending logic, emotion, and moral clarity. He wrote about the sacrifices of the soldiers, the perfidy of the British, and the justice of the American cause. He attacked loyalists and Tories, exposing their hypocrisy and cowardice. And he reminded the colonists of what was at stake, not just independence, but the future of democracy itself. But Paine's role in the war was not just that of a propagandist. He was also a problem solver. In 1777, he proposed a plan to raise funds for the war effort by creating a national bank. The idea was radical at the time, but it worked. The Bank of North America, established in 1781, helped stabilize the Continental Army's finances and kept the Revolution alive. Paine's most dangerous assignment came in 1778, when he was sent to France to negotiate a loan for the American cause. The journey was perilous. His ship was intercepted by a British frigate, and Paine was taken prisoner. For weeks he was held captive, facing the very real possibility of execution as a traitor. But fate intervened. The British captain, unaware of Paine's identity, released him after mistaking him for a harmless civilian. Paine returned to America in 1781, just in time to witness the final stages of the war. The Battle of Yorktown, in October of that year, was the last major engagement of the Revolution. The British surrender was a moment of triumph, but Paine knew that the fight was not yet over. The colonies had won their independence, but they still had to build a nation. As the war drew to a close, Paine reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had arrived in America as a penniless immigrant, a man with little more than a letter of introduction and a dream. Now, he was one of the most influential figures in the new nation. But Paine was not one to rest on his laurels. He had already set his sights on the next battle, shaping the future of the United States. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Revolutionary, Paine's Vision for a New Nation, 1783–1787. The war was over. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, had officially ended the Revolutionary War, and the United States of America was now a sovereign nation. The streets of Philadelphia, the temporary capital, buzzed with excitement and uncertainty. What would this new nation look like? How would it govern itself? These were the questions on everyone's lips, and Thomas Paine had answers. Paine had spent the war years as the Revolution's most eloquent voice, but now he turned his attention to shaping the peace. He believed that independence was only the first step. The real challenge was building a nation that lived up to the ideals of common sense, a nation where liberty, equality, and justice were not just words, but realities. In 1783, Paine published Public Good, a pamphlet arguing for a strong federal government. He warned that the Articles of Confederation, the new nation's first constitution, were too weak to hold the states together. The Articles had created a loose alliance of states, but they had no power to tax, no executive branch, and no way to resolve disputes between states. Paine saw the dangers of this system. "A nation divided against itself cannot stand," he wrote. His words were prophetic. But Paine's vision for America went beyond politics. He was a radical in the truest sense of the word, challenging the injustices of his time with a fearlessness that set him apart. In 1785, he published Dissertations on Government, the Affairs of the Bank, and Paper Money, a series of essays that tackled economic inequality. He proposed a progressive tax system, where the wealthy paid more to support the poor. He argued for public education, believing that an informed citizenry was the foundation of a healthy democracy. And he called for the abolition of slavery, decades before the issue would tear the nation apart. "It is the duty of every man to be just," Paine wrote, "and no man can be just who holds another in bondage." His ideas were ahead of their time, and they made him enemies. The political elite, including many of the Founding Fathers, saw Paine as a dangerous radical. Alexander Hamilton, the architect of the nation's financial system, dismissed Paine's economic proposals as naive. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, feared that Paine's democratic ideals would lead to mob rule. Even George Washington, who had once praised Paine's work, began to distance himself from the man whose words had inspired his troops. But Paine was undeterred. He believed that the revolution was not just about breaking free from Britain. It was about creating a new kind of society, a society where every person, regardless of birth or wealth, had a voice, a society where government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. In 1787, Paine left America for Europe. He had been invited to France to work on a project to build a single-span iron bridge, a revolutionary idea at the time. But his heart was still in America. He carried with him a copy of the new Constitution, which had been drafted in Philadelphia that summer. Paine read it with a critical eye. The Constitution was a step forward, but it was not perfect. It did not abolish slavery. It did not guarantee universal suffrage, and it created a powerful federal government without enough checks on its power. Paine knew that the fight for a truly democratic America was far from over. But for now, he had to turn his attention to Europe. The continent was on the brink of its own revolution, and Paine's words would soon ignite another fire. Chapter 6. The Radical in England, A Revolution of Ideas, 1787-1792. The year 1787 found Thomas Paine in England, a nation teetering on the edge of upheaval. The American Revolution had sent shockwaves through Europe, and Paine, now a celebrated revolutionary, was determined to bring his ideas home. But England was not America. The monarchy was entrenched, the aristocracy was powerful, and the working class was restless. Paine saw an opportunity to ignite change, and he seized it with both hands. Paine arrived in London to find a city divided. The ruling class, led by figures like Edmund Burke, a conservative politician and philosopher, dismissed the French Revolution as a dangerous experiment. Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, was a scathing attack on the revolution's ideals, arguing that it would lead to chaos and tyranny. Paine, who had seen the American Revolution succeed, was outraged. He set to work on a response, and in February 1791 he published Rights of Man, a defense of the French Revolution and a call for political reform in England. The book was a sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and was translated into multiple languages. Paine argued that governments existed to protect the rights of the people, not the privileges of the elite. He called for universal suffrage, progressive taxation, and social welfare programs to support the poor. His ideas resonated with the working class, and he became a hero to radicals across Europe. In London, he joined the London Corresponding Society, a group of working-class reformers who met in taverns and coffee houses to discuss democracy and equality. The society's membership swelled to thousands, and its meetings were often broken up by government spies. But Paine's success came at a cost. The British government, fearful of revolution, branded him a traitor. In May 1792, he was charged with seditious libel, a crime punishable by death. Warned by friends, Paine fled to France, where he was welcomed as a hero and elected to the National Convention. But the French Revolution was not the American Revolution. It was far more violent, far more chaotic, and Paine soon found himself caught in its deadly currents. Paine's time in England was short, but its impact was profound. Rights of Man became a rallying cry for reformers, and Paine's ideas would inspire movements for democracy and social justice for centuries to come. But his flight to France marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test his ideals in ways he never imagined. Chapter 7. The Prisoner of the Terror, A Brush with the Guillotine, 1793 to 1794. Paine arrived in France in September 1792, just as the revolution was entering its most radical phase. He was hailed as a hero, elected to the National Convention, and given the honor of drafting a new constitution for the Republic. But the revolution was spiraling out of control. The monarchy had been overthrown, the king was on trial, and the streets of Paris ran red with the blood of the guillotine. Paine, who had championed the revolution's ideals, now found himself trapped in its violence. Paine sided with the Girondins, a moderate faction that opposed the Jacobins and their leader, Maximilien Robespierre. The Girondins wanted to build a constitutional republic, but the Jacobins sought to purge France of its enemies and create a republic of virtue. When Louis XVI was put on trial for treason in December 1792, Paine argued for mercy. "I vote for the imprisonment of Louis XVI," he declared, "but I vote against his death. Mercy is the noblest quality of a republic." His words fell on deaf ears. The king was executed in January 1793, and the revolution entered its darkest phase. The Reign of Terror began, and thousands were sent to the guillotine, including many of Paine's friends. In December 1793, Paine was arrested on the orders of Robespierre and imprisoned in Luxembourg prison. The charge? Being a foreigner and a Girondin sympathizer. The Jacobins saw him as a threat, a man whose ideas could undermine their revolution. Paine's imprisonment was a surreal experience. He was a man who had dedicated his life to freedom, yet he was now a prisoner in a revolution he had helped inspire. He watched as his friends were taken to the guillotine, one by one. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside Washington in the American Revolution, was imprisoned in Austria. Condorcet, the philosopher and mathematician, was arrested and died in prison. Paine's fellow Girondins were executed in batches, their bodies dumped into mass graves. But Paine was not without allies. James Monroe, the new American minister to France, worked tirelessly for his release. Monroe argued that Paine was an American citizen, not a French one, and that his imprisonment was a violation of international law. The French government, eager to avoid a diplomatic incident, finally agreed to release Paine in November 1794, just days after the fall of Robespierre. The Reign of Terror was over, but the revolution was far from finished. Paine emerged from prison a changed man. He was physically weakened, his health broken by the harsh conditions. But his spirit was unbroken. He had survived the guillotine, and he was determined to continue the fight for liberty. In his cell, he had begun writing The Age of Reason, a book that would challenge the very foundations of organized religion. It was a testament to his unyielding commitment to reason, and a final act of defiance against the forces of tyranny. Chapter 8. The Age of Reason, the book that made America turn its back, 1794-1802. Thomas Paine returned to America in 1802, expecting a hero's welcome. After all, he had helped inspire the Revolution, shaped the nation's early years, and defended its ideals in Europe. But the America he returned to was not the one he had left. The nation had changed, and so had its people. The revolutionary fervor of the 1770s had given way to a more conservative era, and Paine's radical ideas were no longer in vogue. Paine's troubles began with The Age of Reason, a book he had written during his imprisonment in France. Published in 1794-1795, the book was a critique of organized religion, arguing that reason and science, not dogma, were the path to truth. Paine was a deist, not an atheist. He believed in a creator but rejected the Bible and organized religion. But his critics misinterpreted his words, branding him an atheist, a heretic, and a drunkard. Even his former allies turned their backs on him. Thomas Jefferson, who had just been elected president, was one of the few who still supported Paine. But Jefferson was a politician, and he knew that associating with Paine could be political suicide. He never invited Paine to the White House, and their support was limited to private correspondence. Jefferson admired Paine's work, but publicly distanced himself from the controversy surrounding The Age of Reason. In a letter to a friend, Jefferson wrote, "I steer my ship with caution. Paine is a good man, but his ideas are too radical for these times." Paine was undeterred. He settled in New York City, where he continued to write and speak out on the issues of the day. He published a series of essays attacking the Federalist Party, which he saw as a threat to democracy. He defended Jefferson's presidency, praising his commitment to liberty and equality, and he continued to advocate for the abolition of slavery, a cause he had championed since his earliest days in America. In 1807, he published Agrarian Justice, a pamphlet that proposed a radical new idea, a social welfare system funded by a tax on landowners. It was a precursor to modern welfare programs, and it reflected Paine's lifelong commitment to economic justice. But Paine's health was failing. The years in prison had taken their toll, and he suffered from chronic pain and fatigue. He spent his days in a small apartment on Grove Street, surrounded by books and papers. He was often visited by young radicals who saw him as a living link to the Revolutionary era. They listened as he told stories of the Revolution, of Washington and Lafayette, of the battles he had fought with his pen. Paine knew his time was running out, but he refused to go quietly. He had one last battle to fight, and he was determined to win it. Chapter 9. The Last Radical. Paine's Final Battles, 1802–1809. New York City in the early 1800s was a far cry from the revolutionary hotbed Paine had left behind. The city was growing, bustling with merchants, immigrants, and politicians, but the spirit of rebellion had faded. The nation was now led by men who valued order over revolution, and Paine's radical ideas were seen as relics of a bygone era. Yet, Paine refused to be silenced. Even in his final years, he remained a thorn in the side of the establishment, a man who refused to bow to convention or compromise his principles. Paine's return to America had not been the triumphant homecoming he had imagined. Instead, he found himself a pariah, shunned by many of his former allies. The Federalist newspapers, led by the likes of William Cobbett, launched vicious attacks on his character. They called him a drunkard, an atheist, and a traitor. Cobbett, who had once admired Paine, now wrote that he was a lying, drunken, brutal infidel. The attacks were personal, but Paine refused to back down. He fired back with essays of his own, defending his ideas and exposing the hypocrisy of his critics. One of his most bitter feuds was with John Adams, the second President of the United States. Adams had never forgiven Paine for the Age of Reason and saw him as a dangerous radical. In 1805, Paine published Letters to the Citizens of the United States, a series of essays attacking Adams and the Federalist Party. He accused Adams of betraying the principles of the Revolution and warned that the Federalists were leading the nation toward monarchy. Adams, in turn, dismissed Paine as a filthy little atheist. But Paine's most important battle in these final years was not against his political enemies. It was against the institution of slavery. Paine had been an abolitionist since his earliest days in America, and he saw slavery as the greatest moral stain on the nation. In 1805, he published To the People of England on the Invasion of England, a pamphlet that condemned slavery as a crime against humanity. He argued that the slave trade was a violation of the principles of liberty and justice, and he called on the American people to abolish it once and for all. His words fell on deaf ears, but Paine refused to give up. He believed that the fight for abolition was the next great battle for liberty, and he was determined to see it through. Paine's health continued to decline, but he refused to slow down. In 1806, he published Constitutional Reform, a pamphlet that proposed sweeping changes to the U.S. Constitution. He argued for universal suffrage, an end to property qualifications for voting, and a system of checks and balances to prevent the concentration of power. It was a radical vision for a more democratic America, and it reflected Paine's lifelong commitment to the ideals of the Revolution. By 1809, Paine was a broken man. His body was racked with pain, his finances were in ruins, and his friends were few. But his mind remained sharp, and his spirit was unbroken. He spent his final days dictating letters to his few remaining allies, urging them to continue the fight for liberty. On his deathbed, he refused the last rites, staying true to his belief in a creator, not a creed. Thomas Paine knew his time was running out, but he also knew that his ideas would live on. Chapter 10. The Death of a Revolutionary, A Funeral Without Mourners, 1809. The morning of June 8, 1809, was gray and overcast, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the passing of a great man. Thomas Paine died in his small apartment on Grove Street in New York City, surrounded by a handful of friends. He was 72 years old, a relic of a revolutionary era that had long since passed. The man who had inspired millions with his words was now gone, and the world seemed to barely notice. Paine's death was not the grand affair one might have expected for a man of his stature. There were no eulogies in Congress, no state funerals, no tributes from the nation's leaders. Instead, his funeral was a quiet, almost secretive affair. Only 6 people attended: his landlord, 2 free black men who had cared for him in his final days, a Quaker couple, and his friend Wilbert Willets. The Federalist newspapers, which had spent years attacking him, barely mentioned his passing. The New York Evening Post dismissed him in a single sentence: Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, died yesterday in this city. Paine had left specific instructions for his burial. He wanted to be laid to rest in a Quaker cemetery in accordance with his father's faith. But the Quakers refused. They saw him as a heretic, a man who had rejected the teachings of the church. His body was instead buried on a small farm in New Rochelle, New York, a piece of land he had purchased years earlier. The grave was unmarked, a simple plot of earth that would soon be forgotten. But Paine's story did not end with his death. In 1819, William Cobbett, the same man who had spent years attacking Paine, had a change of heart. Cobbett, now a radical reformer himself, decided to exhume Paine's body and bring it back to England. He believed that Paine deserved a hero's burial, a final tribute to his role in the fight for liberty. Cobbett traveled to New Rochelle, dug up Paine's remains, and brought them back to England in a wooden coffin. But Cobbett's plan for a grand funeral never materialized. The British government, still fearful of Paine's radical legacy, refused to allow his remains to be buried in England. Cobbett kept the coffin in his attic for years, a macabre relic of a man who had been forgotten by the world. Eventually the coffin was lost, and Paine's bones were scattered. To this day, no one knows where they are. Paine's death was a tragic end for a man who had given so much to the cause of liberty. But it was also a testament to his legacy. He had spent his life challenging the powerful, speaking truth to those who would rather not hear it. He had been vilified, imprisoned, and forgotten, but he had never compromised his beliefs. In the end, he died as he had lived, a radical, a revolutionary, and a man who believed in the power of ideas to change the world. Chapter 11. The Legacy, How Paine's Words Outlived Him, 1809-present. Thomas Paine's death marked the end of an era, but his ideas refused to die. In the decades that followed, his words would inspire new generations of radicals, reformers, and revolutionaries. From the abolitionist movement to the fight for women's suffrage, from the labor struggles of the 19th century to the civil rights movement of the 20th, Paine's legacy lived on. One of the first to invoke Paine's name was William Lloyd Garrison, the fiery abolitionist who founded the Liberator in 1831. Garrison saw Paine as a kindred spirit, a man who had fought against oppression in all its forms. He quoted Paine's words in his speeches and wrote essays about his life, ensuring that Paine's legacy would not be forgotten. Paine was the first to dare the storm of popular prejudice, Garrison wrote. He was the first to proclaim the rights of man and the first to denounce the wrongs of slavery. Paine's influence extended beyond America. In Europe, his ideas inspired the Chartist movement, a working-class struggle for political reform in Britain. The Chartists, who demanded universal suffrage and an end to property qualifications for voting, saw Paine as their intellectual forefather. His Rights of Man became a rallying cry for the movement, and his words were read aloud at meetings and protests. In the 20th century, Paine's legacy took on new life. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King, Jr., drew inspiration from Paine's belief in equality and justice. King often quoted Paine's words in his speeches, using them to rally support for the fight against segregation and discrimination. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," King declared, echoing the words of the Declaration of Independence, which Paine had helped inspire, that all men are created equal. Paine's ideas also found a home in the labor movement. Eugene Debs, the socialist leader and founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, saw Paine as a champion of the working class. Debs quoted Paine in his speeches and wrote about his life, ensuring that his ideas would reach a new audience. Paine was a radical in the truest sense of the word, Debs wrote. He believed in the power of the people to change the world. But Paine's legacy was not just confined to political movements. His ideas about democracy, liberty, and human rights became the foundation of modern political thought. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, echoes many of the principles Paine championed. His belief in the power of reason and his commitment to justice continue to inspire thinkers and activists around the world. In the 21st century, Paine's words have taken on new relevance. In an era of political polarization, rising inequality, and global unrest, his call for liberty and justice resonates more than ever. From the Arab Spring to the Black Lives Matter movement, Paine's ideas continue to inspire those who fight for a better world. Chapter 12. The Flame That Never Dies. Why Paine Matters Today. The story of Thomas Paine is more than just a tale of the past. It is a story for our time, a reminder of the power of ideas to change the world. Paine was a man who dared to challenge the status quo, who spoke truth to power, and who believed in the possibility of a better future. His life is a testament to the enduring power of radical thought, and his words continue to inspire those who fight for justice and liberty. So why does Paine matter today? Because the battles he fought are still being waged. The struggle for democracy, for equality, for human rights. These are not relics of the past. They are the defining challenges of our time. Paine's belief in the power of reason, his commitment to justice, and his unwavering faith in the ability of ordinary people to change the world are as relevant today as they were in the 18th century. Imagine Paine in the modern world. What would he think of the Internet, a tool that has democratized information and given a voice to millions? He would likely see it as the ultimate expression of his belief in the power of ideas. What would he think of the global movements for climate justice, racial equality, and economic fairness? He would see them as the natural successors to the revolutions he helped inspire. Paine's life is a reminder that change is possible, but it requires courage. It requires a willingness to speak out, even when the world seems against you. It requires a belief in the power of ideas to shape the future. Paine never backed down from a fight, and he never compromised his principles. He was a man who lived by his words, and his words continue to live on. As we reflect on Paine's legacy, we must ask ourselves, what would he think of the world today? Would he see progress, or would he see the same old battles being fought in new ways? Would he be inspired by the movements for justice and equality, or would he be dismayed by the persistence of oppression and inequality? One thing is certain, Paine would not be silent. He would be in the streets, pen in hand, writing pamphlets and rallying the people. He would be challenging the powerful, speaking truth to those who would rather not hear it. He would be reminding us that the fight for liberty is never truly over, that the flame of revolution must be kept alive. So let us take up that flame. Let us be inspired by Paine's courage, his conviction, and his unwavering belief in the power of the people. Let us carry his words forward, not as relics of the past, but as tools for the future. For the flame that Paine lit has never died, and it is up to us to keep it burning.
Thank you, Ben, for bringing Thomas Paine's incredible story to life with such passion and depth. From his humble beginnings in Thetford to his role as the spark that lit the American Revolution, Paine's life reminds us that one person's words can change the world. We've journeyed through his triumphs and trials, his battles for independence, his imprisonment during the French Revolution, his radical ideas on democracy and human rights, and his tragic but unforgettable legacy. But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Unbound American Stories is here to inspire you to dig deeper, to question, and to explore the figures who shaped our nation in ways we're still uncovering. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next story. Who should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep the flame of curiosity alive.